When they cut the padlock, they thought they were removing an eyesore. They didn't realize they were unplugging 200 lives. I was standing at my kitchen window with a mug of coffee gone cold in my hand when I saw the HOA landscaping crew roll up to the fenced utility easement at the edge of our subdivision. It was a bright Saturday morning, one of those clean suburban mornings that make everything look harmless. Freshly edged lawns, sprinkler mist hanging in the air, the smell of mulch and jasmine drifting between houses. The kind of morning when trouble doesn't announce itself. It just puts on a reflective vest and starts working. At first, I thought they were there to trim back the overgrowth. The HOA board had been obsessed for months with curb appeal, a phrase our president, Denise Halpern, said the way some people say national security. Denise believed every bush, every mailbox, every shade of exterior paint was part of a war against imperfection. And at the center of her newest crusade was the green transformer box near the walking path behind the model homes. She hated it, said it was ugly, said it lowered the visual harmony of the neighborhood, said prospective buyers touring Phase 3 shouldn't have to look at industrial hardware when they imagined their future. I knew exactly what that box was because I'd spent 18 years as an electrical systems technician before taking early retirement after my wife passed. You don't stop noticing infrastructure once you've spent your life keeping it alive. That box wasn't decorative clutter. It was a pad-mounted distribution transformer feeding a large section of the community, street lighting, irrigation controllers, garage circuits, and a lot of homes on the East Loop. It sat inside a locked metal cage with warning placards the size of serving trays. Danger. High voltage. Utility access only. Which was why, when I saw two men in HOA polo shirts standing there with bolt cutters while the landscaping supervisor pointed at the lock, my stomach tightened. I set the mug down so fast coffee splashed across the sill. By the time I got out the front door and cut across the common strip, they already had the gate open. Denise was there too, naturally, wearing white sneakers that had never touched honest dirt, holding a clipboard like she was conducting a military operation. "Morning, Mr. Mercer," she called when she saw me approaching. Her tone had that sugary brightness people use when they're sure they outrank common sense. "We're finally having that ugly box removed. You'll be happy to know the area is being replanted with ornamental grasses and stone." I stopped a few feet from the open cage and stared at her. "That isn't yours to remove." She gave me a smile so patient it felt insulting. "Actually, it's on HOA-managed common property. It belongs to the utility," I said. "And if anyone disconnects or moves it without utility authorization, you're not landscaping. You're interfering with active electrical distribution." One of the workers glanced at me, suddenly less confident, but Denise stepped in before doubt could spread. "We've been over this," she said. "I sent notices. No one from the utility responded. So we're handling it." That sentence told me everything. Somewhere in her mind, silence had become permission. Somewhere in her mind, a board vote outweighed engineering. I looked past her and saw they'd already brought in a skid steer. Chains lay coiled in the grass near the transformer pad. "Denise," I said, lowering my voice the way you do when panic is close and you don't want it to own the moment. "If that cabinet is live and they shift it even a few inches, best case you drop service to a large section of the neighborhood. Worst case, somebody dies." She folded her arms. "You retired men always think every rule is life and death." Then she nodded to the crew. "Go ahead." What happened next took less than a minute and felt like watching someone strike a match in a dry forest. The chain tightened. The box lurched. There was a sharp metallic groan, then a sound I knew too well. A violent internal pop, deep and wrong, followed by a flash that burst from beneath the cabinet like a camera exploding underground. The skid steer operator slammed backward. Every house behind me seemed to blink in the same instant. Porch lights died. Garage doors froze mid-cycle. The fountain at the entrance stopped. Then came the silence. That strange, full silence when an entire electrical grid segment drops at once, and all the little mechanical hums of neighborhood life disappear together. Denise stared at the dead transformer, her face drained white. Somewhere down the street, someone shouted. A baby began crying through an open window. My phone buzzed with emergency outage alerts before I even pulled it from my pocket. I looked at Denise, who suddenly seemed much smaller without authority to hide inside, and said the only honest thing left in the moment. "You didn't remove an eyesore," I told her. You just blacked out 200 homes. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The skid steer engine idled with a rough mechanical cough, the driver frozen behind the glass, his hands still locked around the controls like he was afraid letting go would somehow make it more real. Denise's clipboard slipped from her fingers and landed face down in the mulch. One of the HOA workers took a step back from the open utility cage so fast he nearly tripped over the chain. Across the street, a garage door hung halfway open like a mouth interrupted mid-sentence. Then the neighborhood woke up all at once. Front doors opened. People stepped onto porches blinking into the sudden stillness, phones already in hand, glancing at dark windows and dead porch lights as if the answer might be written somewhere outside. A woman in running clothes shouted, "Did the whole block lose power?" A man farther down yelled that his air conditioner had cut off. Somewhere a car alarm gave one weak chirp and died. Denise bent to grab her clipboard, more out of instinct than purpose, and looked at me with the first real crack in her confidence. "Call somebody," she said. It wasn't a request. It was the voice of a person used to consequences arriving in other people's uniforms. "Already happening," I said, lifting my phone. The utility outage map was updating by the second, a red bloom spreading across the east side of our development. One affected circuit. Estimated customers impacted. 187, then 194, then 203 as the system reconciled feeder data. I dialed the emergency number posted on the warning placard because at that point there was no pretending this was a maintenance issue. This was damage to energized distribution equipment. When the dispatcher answered, I gave the subdivision name, the transformer ID stenciled on the cabinet, and the shortest version of the truth. Unauthorized removal attempt by HOA contractor. Equipment shifted. Flash event. Major outage. Possible structural damage to pad mount and terminations. The dispatcher went very quiet in the way trained people do when they hear exactly the wrong words in exactly the wrong order. "Keep everyone clear," she said. "Crew and engineer are being dispatched now. No one is to touch the cabinet, fence, chain, or vehicle." I looked at the skid steer operator, who was now climbing down with shaking legs. "You heard that," I said. "Back everyone away." Denise recovered just enough to put authority back into her posture. "We need to control the narrative," she said under her breath, mostly to herself, but loud enough for me to hear. That was the moment I realized she still didn't understand the scale of what she'd done. She was thinking in terms of board meetings, resident complaints, legal phrasing. I was thinking about load balancing, damaged bushings, possible cable stress, whether the primary feed had faulted cleanly upstream, and how many houses had medical devices, refrigerated medications, or infants in heat-sensitive rooms. Power outages look inconvenient from the outside. From the inside, they reveal how fragile comfort really is. Within 10 minutes, the sidewalks were crowded. Residents clustered in little islands of speculation, each group building its own version of events. The landscaping crew had hit a line. A car had crashed into a utility box. There'd been an underground explosion. Then someone pointed to the open cage, the cut lock, the dragged transformer, and the story stopped being mysterious. It became visible. People started looking at Denise. She felt it. Her jaw tightened. "Nobody has the full facts yet," she announced to anyone within earshot. "Let's not jump to conclusions." "You gave the order," I said, not loudly, but clearly enough that several heads turned. "I advised you not to." Her eyes snapped to mine. "This is not the time." "No," I said. "This is exactly the time." Before she could answer, we heard the first utility truck coming in from the main boulevard, heavy diesel rumbling over the speed bump at the entrance. Then a second truck behind it. Both white, both marked with the electric company logo, both carrying men whose weekends had just been hijacked by somebody else's ego. The lead vehicle stopped hard near the curb, and 2 line workers climbed out, taking in the scene with one sweep of practiced eyes. But the third person to step down was the one who changed the whole atmosphere. He was in a hard hat, safety glasses, dark blue field jacket, and carried no visible rush in his movements, which, in my experience, usually meant he was the one everybody else listened to. He walked straight to the transformer, crouched near the concrete pad, without crossing the safety perimeter, studied the shifted cabinet, the disturbed conduits, the chain marks, the cut lock hanging broken against the fence. Then he stood, turned toward the crowd, and asked in a calm voice that carried farther than a shout, "Who authorized this transformer to be removed?" Nobody answered immediately. Denise opened her mouth, closed it, then finally lifted her chin. "I did," she said. The engineer looked at her for one long second, then glanced past her at the darkened rows of homes stretching down the East Loop. When he spoke again, his tone never changed, which somehow made it hit harder. "Then maybe you can explain," he said, "why 200 homes just went dark." The silence after that question felt heavier than the outage itself. People who had been murmuring only seconds before stopped cold, like the engineer's words had reached into the crowd and switched something off there too. Denise stood with one hand still resting on her clipboard, but now it looked less like a badge of authority and more like something she was holding so she wouldn't have to admit her hands were shaking. "We manage this property," she said at last, her voice thinner than before. "That structure was creating aesthetic concerns, and..." The engineer raised one hand, not rudely, just firmly enough to stop the sentence before it embarrassed her further. "Ma'am," he said, "that structure is a live pad-mounted distribution transformer serving a major lateral office feeder. It was not abandoned. It was not decorative. It was not yours." He turned to the line workers. "Nobody touches the cabinet until we verify isolation upstream. I want barrier tape wider than this crowd thinks necessary." The two line workers moved immediately, all business, stringing a larger perimeter while one of them radioed dispatch with a concise update that somehow sounded even worse when translated into official language. Unauthorized mechanical displacement of energized equipment. Multiple residential customers affected. Possible termination and conduit damage. Engineering assessment required before re-energization. Residents listened with the same expression people wear in hospitals when they hear doctors using words they don't understand but know they should fear. Denise tried again, shifting to the tone board presidents use at annual meetings when they want to sound cooperative while avoiding blame. "We attempted contact weeks ago. We received no response. The board voted to improve the area. We were acting in the community's interest." The engineer looked at the broken lock, then at the skid steer, then back at her. "The community's interest," he said, "would have been not committing utility interference on energized infrastructure." A few people in the crowd winced. One man near the mail kiosk muttered, "Good Lord." Another resident, Mrs. Alvarez from the corner lot, stepped forward clutching her phone. "My husband's oxygen machine has battery backup, but only for a little while. How long is this going to take?" The question cut through everything else. It shifted the moment from blame to stakes. The engineer's attention moved to her instantly. "We'll know more once we inspect the primary and secondary terminations and confirm whether the fault stayed localized," he said. "Right now I can't give you a safe restoration estimate." Then he added, more gently, "If anyone has medical equipment, medications needing refrigeration, or urgent needs, tell the crew lead now." Suddenly the crowd changed shape. This was no longer gossip. It became logistics. A resident with a diabetic child asked about insulin storage. Someone else said their mother was bedridden and needed powered equipment. A young father asked if the traffic signal at the entrance was affected. It wasn't, but the neighborhood streetlights were. The illusion of suburban self-sufficiency was unraveling in real time, thread by thread. I stepped closer to the engineer once the first wave of questions thinned. "The cabinet shifted about 6 inches, maybe 8, I told him. Flash came from beneath the front right base. Chain pulled from that side first." He gave me a quick assessing glance, recognizing from my wording that I wasn't guessing. "You electrical?" he asked. "Retired distribution tech," I said. He nodded once. "Then you know how lucky this was. If the fault path had gone differently, we'd be calling ambulances before line crews." I looked toward the skid steer operator, who was now sitting on the curb with his elbows on his knees, face pale and stunned. "Yeah," I said. "I know." Denise heard us and stepped in, defensive again because reality was pressing from all sides. The contractor said it looked disconnected. The engineer's expression didn't change. "Did the contractor test it?" "I don't know." "Did anyone from the utility open a work order?" "No." "Did anyone have authorization to cut that lock?" She said nothing. He let the silence answer for her. Around us, more utility vehicles arrived. A supervisor truck. A cable crew. Another engineer. This was growing past a simple outage and into one of those events that creates paperwork thick enough to stop doors. Residents were now filming openly. Phones were raised. Faces were hardening. Denise seemed to realize, maybe for the first time, that this would not be solved with a newsletter and a carefully worded community update. The engineer took out a tablet, photographed the cabinet, the lock, the chain, the skid steer, the warning signs. Then he asked the question that made Denise lose the last of her color. "Who is the HOA's insurance carrier?" he said. "And which board members voted for this removal?" That question landed harder than any accusation could have. Blame can be argued with. Liability cannot. Denise opened her mouth, shut it, then looked around as if one of the other board members might materialize from the azaleas and absorb half the damage. None did. Of course not. People love the authority of a board vote right up until the bill arrives with actual commas in it. "I'd have to check the policy documents," she said, trying for composure and missing by a mile. The engineer tapped something into his tablet. "I suggest you do that quickly." His voice remained calm, almost polite, but there was steel under it now. The line workers had begun their field checks at a safe distance, coordinating with dispatch to confirm the upstream protective device had operated and that the affected segment was de-energized before anyone got near the cabinet. Even from where I stood, I could see enough to know the situation was ugly. The transformer had shifted off alignment on the pad, the conduits at the base were stressed, and one secondary elbow looked wrong, subtly wrong, but enough to tell a trained eye that whatever happened beneath that cabinet wasn't superficial. This wasn't going to be a matter of flipping something back on and pretending the morning never happened. A utility supervisor arrived carrying a folder and the expression of a man already calculating cost, labor, and the number of reports this would trigger before sunset. He spoke quietly with the engineer, both of them glancing now and then toward Denise, the broken gate, and the gathering crowd. It didn't take much imagination to picture the chain of events from their side. Emergency dispatch, unauthorized tampering, public safety exposure, damaged equipment, widespread outage, probable claims. In utility language, this was the sort of incident people remember because it becomes part of training later. On the sidewalk, the residents had sorted themselves into camps. Some were angry in the immediate practical sense. Freezers thawing, Wi-Fi dead, chargers draining, weekend plans collapsing. Others were angrier in a deeper way because they were beginning to understand that this outage wasn't caused by weather or accident or some distant unavoidable failure. It had been chosen, ordered, manufactured by the same HOA that fined people for mismatched flower pots. Mrs. Alvarez was on the phone arranging for her husband to go to her sister's house, where backup power was available. The young father who had asked about the traffic signal was now helping an elderly neighbor carry a portable fan and medications to a car. Small acts of competence were springing up all over the street, and they made the board's incompetence look even more obscene. Denise tried once more to regain control of the public version of reality. She cleared her throat and addressed the crowd. "Let's all remain calm." The board acted based on available information and with the intent of improving property values and community appearance. That did it. A voice from the back snapped. "By cutting a lock that said high voltage?" Another resident added, "You turned off my house for landscaping." Then a third, louder than the rest. "Who voted for this?" Denise's shoulders stiffened. "This is not the forum for..." "No," I said, before she could hide behind procedure again. "This is exactly the forum." 200 homes lost power because warnings were ignored. I hadn't planned to become the unofficial translator between reality and HOA language, but somebody had to say plainly what everyone was now seeing. The engineer gave me a brief look, not approval exactly, but recognition that clarity was doing work here. He stepped toward the residents and spoke in the direct, measured tone professionals use when people deserve the truth. To be clear, this equipment was marked, locked, and part of active electrical service. It should never have been touched by unauthorized persons. Restoration depends on whether the primary conductors, elbows, bushings, and secondary terminations can be made safe today, or whether the unit must be replaced. "Replaced?" somebody echoed. "Possibly," he said. "And if replacement is required, this outage could extend much longer." The reaction rolled through the crowd like a gust through dry leaves. People started checking phones again, this time not for curiosity, but contingency. Hotel prices, relatives nearby, battery percentages, medication timing, food in freezers. Denise looked suddenly stranded, not just by the facts, but by the total collapse of her usual tools. Rules about mailbox paint could not save her here. Neither could newsletters. Neither could smiling while speaking. The utility supervisor approached her with a business card and a form on a clipboard. "We'll need your full name, position, contact information, and the name of the association's legal representative," he said. She stared at the paper without taking it. "Is that necessary right now?" He didn't blink. More necessary than the ornamental grasses were. Even a few exhausted residents laughed at that, short and sharp and joyless. Denise finally took the clipboard. Her hand shook as she wrote. And while she stood there filling in the official record of her own disaster, one of the line workers called out from the transformer, "We've got more damage down here than expected." The engineer looked up at once. "How bad?" The line worker straightened and answered in the voice of a man delivering news no one was going to like. "Bad enough that nobody's getting lights back on anytime soon." That sentence changed the neighborhood more than the outage itself. Until then, people had still been holding onto the suburban fantasy that inconvenience was temporary, that professionals would arrive, tighten a few bolts, flip a switch, and restore the illusion that systems are always smarter than the people who misuse them. But not anytime soon, stripped that comfort bare. You could see it on faces all across the sidewalk. The annoyance drained out, and something heavier took its place. Calculation, worry, anger with roots. People began moving with purpose. Car trunks opened. Coolers appeared. Extension cords were discussed, then dismissed. Residents with family nearby started organizing rides for the elderly. A woman from Cedar Lane offered refrigerator space at her sister's house across town. Someone else made a list of homes with medical concerns. In under 15 minutes, the neighborhood had become more functional without the HOA than it had ever been under it. The engineer crouched again near the cabinet while the line worker pointed with a gloved hand toward the base. Even from outside the barrier, I could make out the problem in fragments. Stress on the conduits, disturbed terminations, evidence of arc damage below grade where the shift had transferred force into places no one should ever force. It wasn't just that the transformer had been moved. It had been yanked against infrastructure designed to remain stable, sealed, and undisturbed. People think electricity lives only in wires. They forget it also depends on stillness. Denise, still clutching the clipboard, tried to salvage what little authority she had left by moving into administrative mode. "We'll issue a communication to all residents," she said to no one in particular. "We'll explain that utility restoration is underway." The utility supervisor turned to her so slowly it seemed deliberate. "No," he said. "You'll explain that unauthorized HOA action caused this outage and that restoration is being assessed by the utility." She blinked at him. "We can't say that until legal reviews." "You can say it now," he replied, "because I'm looking at it." A few residents nearby actually nodded. They didn't need a legal review. They had watched the whole thing happen in broad daylight. Truth had witnesses. That was Denise's real problem. If this had happened behind closed doors, there might have been room for spin, for blame shifting, for board language thick enough to suffocate accountability. But the transformer sat there crooked and scorched like evidence in a trial no one needed to schedule. I walked a little farther down the sidewalk to get away from the swelling cluster of angry questions and called my daughter to let her know I might be unavailable for a while. She lives 2 states away and still worries whenever she hears utility incident in my voice. After I explained the situation, she was silent for a second, then said, "Tell me this wasn't Denise." "It was Denise," I said. "Of course it was Denise." She exhaled in the tired way adult children do when their parents insist on living in places with active drama. "Dad, please don't get dragged into HOA politics again." I looked up at the dead row of houses, the utility trucks, the crowd forming around a mistake too big to deny. "I think HOA politics got dragged into me," I said. When I ended the call, 2 county fire units were pulling into the entrance, not for flames, but for standby safety and resident assistance. Another layer of official presence. Another signal that this had crossed from neighborhood dispute into public incident. Fire personnel began checking whether any residents had immediate health concerns, helping coordinate temporary relocation for those who needed power urgently. One of them spoke with Mrs. Alvarez and arranged transport for her husband. Every additional uniform made Denise look smaller. Every competent response from people outside the HOA sharpened the contrast. Then came the moment that pushed everything over the edge. A black SUV rolled up fast and stopped near the clubhouse path. Out stepped Gerald Pike, the HOA treasurer, still in golf clothes, visor on, phone to his ear, expression already sour with secondhand inconvenience. He had clearly been called after the outage spread through the resident text chain. He marched toward Denise, saw the utility crews, the barriers, the crowd, and stopped short. "What happened?" he demanded. Nobody rushed to answer. That was the first answer. Then 3 residents spoke at once, and every version pointed in the same direction. Denise authorized it. They cut the lock. They moved the transformer. The power died. Gerald stared at her like a man trying to decide whether denial was still available. "Tell me that's not accurate," he said. Denise lifted her chin, but there was no confidence left in the gesture now, only habit. "The board approved beautification measures for the common area," she said. Gerald looked at the crooked transformer, then at the engineer, then at the 200 dark homes behind him. "Beautification?" he repeated. His voice cracked on the word, as if the absurdity of it had finally become too large for speech. The engineer slid his tablet into his jacket pocket and addressed them both. "At this point," he said, "you're not discussing landscaping. You're discussing damages, liability, and why my crews are about to spend the rest of the day undoing something that never should have happened." Gerald Pike had the kind of face that normally stayed pink from golf, red from meetings, or purple from hearing the word special assessment. But as the engineer said liability, something in him seemed to drain and harden at the same time. Treasurers understand numbers in a way presidents rarely do. Denise heard community appearance. Gerald heard emergency crews, equipment replacement, claims exposure, council fees, and reserves evaporating. He took 2 quick steps toward her and lowered his voice, though not enough to keep the nearest residents from hearing. "Tell me you got utility approval in writing." Denise didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. "We sent notices," she said. Gerald closed his eyes for a second. "That is not what I asked. There are moments when a whole structure of power shifts without anyone formally voting on it. This was one of them." Denise had spent months moving through the neighborhood like an elected monarch of mulch and trim color. But now the person who controlled the spreadsheets had arrived, and spreadsheets tend to be less forgiving than egos. Around us, utility crews were transitioning from assessment to containment. Orange cones expanded. More equipment came off trucks. A flatbed was being discussed on the radio. That told me the possibility of replacing the transformer was no longer theoretical. One of the line workers walked over to the engineer carrying a damaged component in a padded tray. And although I couldn't hear the full exchange, I heard enough words to know we were deep into bad territory. Cracked bushing, compromised elbow, likely cable stress, further inspection required below grade. Infrastructure never fails politely once somebody starts yanking on it with a machine. Gerald turned to the engineer with the careful tone of a man stepping into a lawsuit 1 sentence at a time. "How significant are we talking here?" The engineer gave him a look that suggested he had no appetite for softening reality for HOA bookkeeping. "Significant enough that your association should notify council and insurance immediately," he said. "Significant enough that restoration may require replacement equipment, excavation, and a damage review. Significant enough that if this had gone slightly differently, we'd be discussing injuries instead of inconvenience." Gerald swallowed. Denise folded her arms, not in defiance now, but as if trying to physically hold herself together. "No one was hurt," she said quietly. It was the sort of sentence people say when they want mercy for avoiding the worst outcome of their own recklessness. The engineer didn't bite. "That doesn't make this minor," he said. Residents had begun to gather closer again, no longer waiting for updates, but watching the board unravel in public. Once people see authority fail, they become very interested in the details. Questions started coming with less hesitation now. Was there even a permit? Which board members voted yes? Are our dues going to pay for this? Can they be personally liable? That last one changed the board's body language immediately. Denise looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at the ground. A board secretary named Leanne, who had quietly arrived 10 minutes earlier and was standing near the clubhouse path pretending not to exist, suddenly found the flowers beside her fascinating. I knew Leanne by reputation. Careful, procedural, fond of saying she only followed motions already passed. People like that thrive when consequences stay abstract. They become very still when consequences put on steel-toed boots. A resident named Marcus, an attorney who usually avoided neighborhood drama with almost athletic discipline, stepped forward from the crowd. For everyone asking, he said evenly, corporate shields aren't magical if gross negligence is involved, especially if there's documented disregard of obvious warnings. Several heads turned toward Denise at once. She bristled. This is inappropriate. Marcus shrugged. So is cutting a utility lock. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Truth was doing all the work. I watched Gerald process the crowd, the crews, the engineer, the phones filming, the possible invoices already multiplying in his mind. We need an executive session, he muttered. You need electricity, snapped a resident from the curb. We need accountability, said another. And there it was, the neighborhood crossing from irritated to organized. Outages create temporary discomfort. Preventable outages create memory. People would talk about this one at mailboxes, in driveways, at closing tables, in legal consults, and during every future election. The old board culture of low attendance and quiet approvals was dying right there beside the crooked transformer. Then one of the utility supervisors walked over carrying a printed site sketch and asked, "Which one of you is the HOA officer of record for this parcel?" Gerald and Denise both hesitated, each perhaps hoping the other would answer. That hesitation lasted only a second, but it was long enough to be humiliating. Finally, Denise said, "I am." The supervisor nodded and handed her the paper. "Then you need to sign acknowledging site control and unauthorized interference." Denise stared at the form like it was written in another language. Her hand trembled before she even touched the pen, and as she stood there, frozen between pride and documentation, a resident behind me said in a low, stunned voice what everyone was beginning to realize at once. "This isn't just an outage," he said. "This is the end of that board." He was right, and everybody knew it. Not because anyone had held a vote, not because some dramatic declaration had been made from the clubhouse steps, but because the spell was broken. HOA power depends on a strange kind of collective hypnosis. People comply because the rules seem annoying but manageable, because the fines are small enough to pay, because fighting feels exhausting, because the board speaks in bylaws and minutes and procedural fog that makes ordinary residents doubt their own instincts. But once a board does something so obviously reckless, so publicly stupid, so materially harmful that no amount of formal language can cover it, the hypnosis ends. You could see it in the way people were looking at Denise now, not with the cautious politeness reserved for authority, but with the cold, clarifying stare people give to someone who has confused control with competence for too long. She still hadn't signed the utility form. The paper fluttered slightly in her hand from either wind or nerves. Gerald leaned in and whispered something harsh enough to tighten his jaw, but not loud enough to make out. Denise whispered back. Leanne remained by the flower bed, half-hidden, silently calculating whether selective memory could save her. The utility supervisor waited exactly the way people in his line of work know how to wait, with complete patience and zero room for escape. "Ma'am," he said after a moment, "you can sign now, or we can document refusal and proceed accordingly." That finished it. Denise pressed the clipboard against her chest, signed with an angry slash, and handed it back as if force could recover dignity. It did not. The supervisor glanced at the page, nodded once, and walked away to scan and transmit it. Just like that, her decision moved from neighborhood drama into the permanent bloodstream of utility records, insurance files, and whatever legal machinery came next. Across the street, residents had begun grouping not by friendship, but by urgency and common purpose. One cluster was compiling names of affected homes with medical concerns. Another was discussing hotels and reimbursement. A third had shifted fully into political mode, talking recall procedures, board bylaws, emergency meetings, records requests. I recognized that tone immediately. It's the sound people make when irritation matures into organization. Marcus the attorney was now surrounded by neighbors asking practical questions. Can the board hold emergency spending without member notice? What are we entitled to inspect? Do officers have indemnification if they ignored warnings? He answered carefully, not grandstanding. just giving enough structure for anger to become actionable. That was new for this neighborhood. For years, most residents had treated the HOA like weather, annoying, arbitrary, and probably not worth fighting. But weather doesn't cut utility locks. Weather doesn't order machinery against energized equipment because ornamental grasses would look nicer in listing photos. I stayed near the edge of the barrier and watched the crews work. There is a discipline to utility work that always steadies me, even in a mess. No speeches, no ego, just checklists, radios, measurements, protective protocol, documentation, next steps. One line worker I hadn't met before came over carrying a meter bag and asked if I'd been the one who called in the initial report. When I said yes, he nodded. You probably prevented this from getting worse. I looked toward the open cage, the chain still lying in the grass like a stupid weapon after the fact. Didn't stop it from happening, I said. No, he replied. But you got us the right description fast. That matters. Strange how a single calm sentence from a competent person can cut through the ugliness of a day. Before I could respond, a commotion rose near the clubhouse path. More residents were arriving, drawn by text messages, outage alerts, and the unmistakable magnetism of public collapse. One of them was Nora Chun from Birch Court, who ran the unofficial neighborhood message board and possessed the rare skill of sounding reasonable while asking devastating questions. She walked straight up to Gerald and Denise with her phone recording openly. For the sake of residents who weren't present, she said, did the HOA authorize removal of utility equipment without utility approval? Denise's eyes widened. Put that away. Nora did not. That's not an answer. Gerald stepped in, trying to reclaim process. This is an active incident. We'll issue a statement when facts are confirmed. Nora tilted the phone slightly, so it also captured the transformer, the trucks, the barriers, and the dark houses beyond. The facts appear to be standing behind you, she said. Even some of the residents under the oaks let out a low sound that was not quite laughter and not quite disbelief. Denise turned away from the camera, but there was nowhere left to turn. The outage had spread beyond the electrical grid into the one thing HOA boards fear most, a shared narrative they do not control. Then my phone buzzed with a community alert. Not from the board, from the utility. It confirmed a major service interruption caused by unauthorized interference with company equipment and advised extended restoration time. I read it once, then looked up at Denise just as Gerald read the same message over her shoulder. His expression tightened into something close to panic, because now the truth wasn't just visible. It was official. Official truth has a different weight than neighborhood gossip. Gossip can be argued with, diluted, reframed, buried under committee language and procedural delay. Official truth arrives stamped, timed, documented, and almost insultingly indifferent to your preferred version of events. The utility alert moved through the subdivision faster than the outage had. Phones lit up all along the sidewalks. People who had still been willing to say, let's wait for more information, now had more information than the board could survive. Unauthorized interference. Extended restoration time. Company equipment. No mention of beautification. No mention of misunderstanding. No mention of community intent. Just the plain, merciless shape of what had happened. Gerald read the alert twice, lips moving slightly on the second pass, as if repetition might reveal a hidden softer meaning. It did not. Denise tried to see over his shoulder, then straightened with that brittle dignity people reach for when the floor has already given way. They didn't need to phrase it like that, she said. I actually stared at her for a second, not because I was shocked anymore, but because some people can stand in the wreckage of their own choices and still critique the wording of reality. Gerald looked at her in open disbelief. Like what? He hissed. Accurately. Around us, residents began reading the alert aloud to one another. Every repetition hit the board like another hammer blow. Nora Chun was already posting it to the neighborhood feed with a screenshot. Marcus was speaking quietly with 3 homeowners about emergency records preservation and board communications. Mrs. Alvarez had left with fire personnel and her husband, but not before telling 2 separate groups exactly who had ignored the warning signs. The story had escaped containment. It would now replicate on every phone, every text thread, every kitchen island in the development. One of the utility crew members called for additional floodlighting equipment if repairs extended into evening, which told me they were preparing for a long haul. The engineer stood near the supervisor reviewing a restoration sequence, tracing with a gloved finger where excavation might be needed if the underground terminations had shifted farther than they hoped. Infrastructure has a way of punishing arrogance in layers. First the visible damage, then the hidden damage, then the cost of discovering how much you still can't see. Gerald rubbed a hand over his face and turned to Denise with the hollow urgency of a man whose budget just burst into flames. Did you at least consult association counsel before ordering this? Denise hesitated. I mentioned the transformer issue in general terms at the last meeting. That's not consulting counsel. We discussed nuisance visibility and common area enhancement. That is still not consulting counsel. Leanne, still hovering at the edge, finally spoke, her voice small. The minutes only say the board approved removal of obstructive utility-adjacent structures if no objection was received. Even Gerald seemed stunned by that sentence. Utility-adjacent structures? He repeated. What does that even mean? Leanne shrank a little under the attention. Denise drafted the wording. Of course she had. Ambiguity is often the costume bad decisions where before they become disasters. But ambiguous minutes don't help much when there are cut locks, witness statements, contractor involvement, and a dead transformer sitting crooked in the grass for everyone to photograph. And people were photographing it from every angle now. Not just residents. Delivery drivers slowing at the entrance. A local reporter, if my eyes were right, stepping out of a hatchback and scanning for the person most likely to answer badly on camera. Denise saw her too. Oh no, she said, and in those two words was packed more genuine emotion than she had shown for 200 dark homes. The reporter approached with the efficient politeness of someone who had covered enough municipal nonsense to recognize premium footage when she saw it. I'm with Channel 8 Local, she said. Can someone from the HOA comment on reports that board-directed contractors interfered with utility equipment, causing a neighborhood outage? Gerald took one involuntary step backward. Denise recovered just enough to say, We're still gathering facts. The reporter glanced past her at the utility trucks, the barrier tape, the crooked transformer, and the residents filming from 3 directions. What facts are missing? She asked. It was a beautiful question because it left no room for theatrical vagueness. Denise's mouth opened, then closed. Gerald jumped in. This was an unfortunate incident under review. The reporter's expression barely changed. Did the HOA authorize the work? She asked. We'll provide a written statement, Gerald said. Did the HOA authorize the work? She repeated. This time several residents answered before either board member could. Yes, she did. We all saw it. The reporter turned toward the crowd, and just like that, the board lost not only control of the story but control of who got to tell it. I watched Denise realize it a beat too late. There is a particular look people get when they understand that consequences have moved beyond private repair. It is part anger, part disbelief, part naked fear. She was wearing it now. And then, as if the day had not yet made its point hard enough, the engineer received a call on his radio handset, listened for 5 seconds, and said the words that made Gerald physically sway where he stood. Understood, he replied. Then he faced the board and said, The replacement unit is coming from another district. You're going to want to sit down before you hear the preliminary damage estimate. Nobody sat down. That was the first honest reaction of the afternoon. Sitting implies stability, a temporary pause before reasoned discussion, some faint belief that numbers can be absorbed in a civilized posture. But there was nothing stable left in that corner of the subdivision. The transformer stood crooked inside its violated cage. The utility easement looked like a crime scene designed by a landscaping committee, and 200 homes were learning in real time how expensive vanity becomes when it acquires machinery. Gerald's knees may have wanted a chair, but his pride kept him upright. How bad? He asked, and for once he didn't try to sound in control. The engineer gave him the kind of look doctors give before using words patients will remember for years. Preliminary only, he said. Replacement unit mobilization, emergency crew hours, engineering response, probable excavation, damage terminations, equipment disposal, restoration labor, and incident processing. He paused just long enough for each category to land. If no additional underground damage is found, you're likely looking at a low 6-figure event. It was almost impressive how quiet a crowded neighborhood could become. Even the reporter lowered her microphone a fraction. Denise stared at the engineer as if he had spoken in another language. Gerald made a small sound. Not quite a word. More like the human version of a spreadsheet catching fire. Leanne actually reached out and grabbed the back of a nearby bench to steady herself. Somebody in the crowd whispered, 6 figures? And somebody else answered, for flowers. That line spread faster than the utility alert had. For flowers. 3 words. Simple enough to survive retelling, sharp enough to become permanent. You could already hear the future in it. At barbecue grills, in closing disclosures, at the annual meeting when residents stood at microphones with printed documents in hand. The board had accidentally manufactured its own slogan. Gerald found his voice first. Insurance will cover that, he said, but he said it the way people say things they desperately need to be true, not things they know. The engineer didn't challenge him directly. Professionals rarely bother arguing with hope. That's between your carrier, counsel, and whatever liability review follows, he said. My job is restoration and documentation. The reporter, to her credit, understood exactly where to press next. Can you confirm, she asked, angling toward Gerald and Denise, that the Homeowners Association may be responsible for damages exceeding $100,000 after authorizing unauthorized work on live electrical infrastructure? Gerald snapped his head toward her. No one has established responsibility yet. Marcus, from somewhere behind me, said dryly. That process appears to be moving briskly. A few residents laughed again. That short, exhausted laugh people use when disbelief has become communal. Utility crews kept moving with their same steady focus, indifferent to the human drama orbiting their work. A replacement transformer was now officially inbound. A digging contractor had been alerted. Temporary traffic control was discussed in case excavation equipment blocked the path near the East Loop. Restoration estimates were being updated by the hour, not the minute. This was no longer a bad morning. It was becoming an operational event. I walked over to the outer edge of the crowd where a cluster of residents were comparing outage impacts. One woman had lost a freezer full of catered food for her daughter's graduation party. Another family had a child on the autism spectrum struggling hard with the disruption and heat. An older man worried about his heart medication. Problems multiply quickly once power disappears, and they do not care whether the original cause was arrogance, ignorance, or landscaping aesthetics. That is the thing people misunderstand about infrastructure. When it fails, failure travels. Denise finally seemed to grasp, at least in fragments, that this was no longer about blame avoidance. Can we restore service to part of the neighborhood sooner? She asked the engineer, as if asking nicely might alter electrical reality. He answered without cruelty, but with no softness either. Not safely until we know what's compromised. But some homes, all homes on that lateral matter equally. That shut her down. For months, she had governed by selective urgency. This complaint important, that one delayed. This violation punished, that one excused. The grid had no interest in her hierarchy. The dead homes were democratically dark. The reporter was now interviewing residents on camera, and one after another they said versions of the same thing. We saw it happen. He warned her. They cut the lock anyway. The power went out immediately. Truth, once repeated by enough ordinary witnesses, becomes very difficult to litigate into silence. Gerald's phone rang. He looked at the screen and blanched. It's our insurer, he muttered. Then another call came in almost at once. And legal. He looked at Denise with the hollow resentment of a man already calculating what this would cost not just in dollars, but in position, reputation, and years of ugly meetings. She looked back at the dark houses, then at the cameras, then at the engineers unloading equipment brought in from another district because her ornamental vision had physically ripped power out of the ground. And in that terrible stillness, before either of them answered their phones, the crowd saw something almost as important as the damage itself. The board wasn't just wrong. It was scared.